For most of the 1980s, the Gotti family seemed to have found something close to a magic trick. It was the kind of trick that should not have been possible inside a courtroom, where the rules are written down and the stakes are measured in decades, and yet there it was, performed again and again in front of judges and juries and reporters who could not quite explain what they were watching. Witnesses who had pointed at a Gotti and named him to a grand jury would climb into the witness chair months later and announce that their memory had failed them. Jurors who walked into deliberation rooms convinced of guilt would walk out hours later having voted to acquit. Charges that looked airtight, built on surveillance and informants and years of patient federal work, would reach the moment of decision and simply fail to stick. The press gave the man at the center of it a name that captured the mystery without explaining it. They called him the Teflon Don, because nothing the government threw at him would hold. But the trick was never evenly distributed across the family, and that is the part of the story almost no one tells. Two brothers stood at the center of the same organization, protected by the same lawyers, defended with the same money, shielded by the same campaign of fear that bent witnesses and bought jurors. One of them would beat the law over and over until his face was on the cover of every tabloid in New York. The other would take 50 years in a federal prison for the same kind of life, and would serve nearly 3 decades of it in a cell in Louisiana. The difference between the two fates did not come down to talent, or nerve, or even luck. It came down to a single set of tape recordings made inside one house in Queens, recordings that destroyed one brother and crowned the other in the very same breath. Drop a comment and let me know what city or country you are listening from. It is one of my favorite parts of doing this. If stories like this one are your thing, the kind of history that hides in plain sight, subscribe so the next one finds its way to you. Now, back to those tape recordings and the two brothers whose lives they split cleanly in half. By the spring of 1987, John Gotti had beaten 3 serious attempts to put him in prison in the space of roughly a year, and he had done it with a swagger that turned each defeat for the government into a piece of his growing legend. He arrived at the courthouse in hand-tailored suits that cost $1,000 apiece, his silver hair swept straight back, smiling for the cameras as though the trials were a kind of theater stage for his benefit. The newspapers loved him. They called him the Dapper Don for the clothes and the Teflon Don for the acquittals, and the two nicknames together built an image of a man who had risen above the ordinary mechanics of crime and punishment, a gangster who could not be caught. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse to cheer him as though he were a movie star rather than a man accused of murder. He was, for a few years in the late 1980s, one of the most famous men in America, and he had become famous for the specific and remarkable reason that the law could not touch him. His younger brother stood in a different place entirely. While John collected acquittals and headlines, Gene Gotti spent more than 4 years free on a bail bond of $1 million, waiting for a heroin case to come to trial, a case that would not resolve, that kept collapsing and restarting like a machine that could not be made to run. Gene was the quiet one. Where John wore custom suits and worked the cameras, Gene favored plain blue and gray, and put on a tie only when a courtroom required it. Where John commanded a room, Gene was remembered by the men around him as slow to follow a conversation, a man people learned to address carefully and more than once if they wanted to be understood. In public, outside the family's clubhouse in Queens, Gene held the umbrella over his brother's head when it rained. That was the shape of the relationship, and it would hold all the way to the end. The family fought for Gene with everything it had. The same lawyers who defended John defended Gene. The same money flowed. The same tactics that had freed the boss again and again were turned to saving the boss's brother, because that was simply what the organization did for its own. There is no surviving record of a private moment in which John leaned in and promised Gene that he would beat the case. No transcript of those words, and it would be dishonest to invent one. But the effort itself is documented beyond any doubt, written into the record of 2 mistrials that did not happen by accident. The whole machinery that had made John Gotti untouchable was put into motion on Gene's behalf. To understand why it worked for one brother and failed for the other, and why the failure came to 50 years, you have to go back to a coal block in Brooklyn, long before either of them owned a courtroom. The Gotti story begins not with money or power, but with the absence of both. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27th, 1940, in the South Bronx, the fifth of 13 children born to John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Filomena DiCarlo, whom everyone called Fanny. Two of those 13 children died at birth. The parents were the children of Italian immigrants, and the father worked irregularly as a day laborer, a man who, at one point, earned about $52.80 a month on a public works crew, and who gambled away too much of whatever he managed to bring home. There was never enough of anything. The family moved often through the boroughs before settling, when John was about 12, in the East New York section of Brooklyn, a neighborhood where the line between the street and the rackets was thin and easily crossed in either direction. John grew up resenting his father for the poverty, for the inability to provide, and he decided early and with a kind of cold certainty that he would not live the way his father had lived. He was a violent and willful boy. He earned a reputation for fighting and for a temper that frightened the other children, and he drifted toward the older men in the neighborhood who carried themselves with money and ease, the men connected to the Mafia families that ran the local economy of vice. At 14, trying to steal a cement mixer from a construction site, he set it rolling, and it came down on his toes, crushing them and leaving him with a limp he would carry for the rest of his life. He dropped out of Franklin K. Lane High School at 16 and gave himself fully to the only ambition he had, which was to rise inside the world of organized crime. He ran errands for Carmine Fatico, a captain in the family that would come to be known as the Gambino family, and through Fatico's world he met Agnello della Croce, a hard and respected man who would become his mentor and protector for the next 2 decades. He formed and led a street gang called the Fulton Rockaway Boys, and among the young men who ran with him were two who would matter enormously to everything that followed: Angelo Ruggiero, a loud and reckless talker, and Wilfred Johnson, known as Willie Boy, an old friend whose later choices would help bring the whole structure down. Gene came along in 1946, 6 years behind John, into the same crowded poverty, and he drifted into the same world, as did the other brothers. Peter, the oldest, born the year before John, and Richard, and eventually Vincent, all moved in the orbit of the Gambino family. But it was John who had the fire and the ambition, and it was Gene who fell into step behind him. Gene was steady and loyal and not especially quick, a follower rather than a leader, the kind of man who is valuable to an organization precisely because he does what he is told and keeps his mouth shut. The brothers committed crimes together from the very start. In 1968, John pleaded guilty to hijacking trucks near the airport in Queens, and the case that put him away also touched Gene and Angelo Ruggiero, the three of them already operating as a single unit. John served about 3 years and came home in 1972, harder and more committed than before. Then came the killing that made his name inside the family. In the early 1970s, a man named James McBratney had been involved in the kidnapping and murder of a nephew of the boss himself, Carlo Gambino. The family wanted McBratney dead, and John Gotti was among the men who killed him. The law caught up to him for it, and in 1975, Gotti was convicted of attempted manslaughter and sentenced to 4 years, serving roughly 2 of them at the Greenhaven prison north of the city. He came out a made man, a formally inducted member of the Gambino family. His reputation built on the most valuable currency the organization recognized, which was a willingness to kill on the family's behalf and to absorb the cost of it without complaint. By the time the brothers were grown men, the streets had assigned each of them a fixed role, and Gene's role, settled and permanent, was to stand beside John. Every catastrophe in this story traces back to one telephone in one house in Queens, and to a man who could not stop talking on it. To reach that telephone, though, you have to start with heroin, and with a fortune built outside the family's rules. Angelo Ruggiero had a brother named Salvatore, called Sal, who had become something the Mafia officially forbade and privately envied, a millionaire from narcotics. Sal Ruggiero ran his own large heroin operation, made himself genuinely rich from it, and became a fugitive from federal justice rather than answer for any of it. Then, in 1982, Sal Ruggiero died in a plane crash, and his death left a profitable and extremely dangerous business sitting unattended, with no one to run it, and a great deal of money still moving through it. The men closest to him moved in to gather up what he had left behind. Angelo Ruggiero stood at the center of it. Around him gathered Gene Gotti, a hard and capable associate named John Carneglia, a trafficker called Mark Ryder, and a crooked lawyer named Michael Coiro, who helped them launder and move the money. They were continuing and winding down Sal's heroin trade, hundreds of pounds of Southeast Asian heroin moving through New York, a business worth many millions of dollars, and they were doing it quietly, or so they believed. What none of them understood was that the federal government had already chosen Angelo Ruggiero as the single weakest point in the entire structure. The man leading the effort against the family was an FBI agent named Bruce Mao, who ran what was called the Gambino Squad, and who had spent years quietly developing informants and mapping out the family's hierarchy from the inside. One of those informants was Willie Boy Johnson, the same Willie Boy who had run the streets with John Gotti as a young man, now secretly feeding the government information under a code name. Johnson told the agents something useful and specific. He told them that the telephone inside Angelo Ruggiero's home was a safe target, that Ruggiero believed it secure and spoke freely on it about everything. Ruggiero had a reputation that made him close to perfect for the purpose. Other gangsters joked that you could dial any 7 numbers at random, and there was a 50-50 chance Angelo would be the one to answer, because the man was forever on the phone. The government got its authorization. On November 9th, 1981, federal agents placed a tap on Angelo Ruggiero's home phone, and they planted additional listening devices throughout the house itself, and for the next 2 years, that equipment captured very nearly everything that was said inside those walls. What the agents heard over and over was the one subject that could get every man on the tape killed. The wiretap had been authorized to investigate loan sharking and gambling, the ordinary daily business of the crew, but it turned quickly and almost entirely to heroin, because heroin was what Ruggiero and Gene Gotti and Carneglia could not stop discussing among themselves. The recordings caught them talking about shipments and money and the mechanics of moving the drug from hand to hand. On one of the tapes, Gene Gotti can be heard insisting on absolute secrecy, telling the others that nobody is to know but us. On another, the conversation turns to a debt owed for a delivery, with Gene noting that the man has already paid and that they owe him 2 kilos in return. This was not vague or deniable talk that a clever lawyer could later wave away. It was the documented sound of a heroin conspiracy, recorded in the participants' own voices, time-stamped and admissible, and it would become the foundation of a major federal narcotics case. But the tapes captured something else as well, something that turned them from a serious legal problem into a death sentence inside the family itself. Angelo Ruggiero could not stop running his mouth about the boss. The man who sat at the top of the Gambino family was Paul Castellano, who had inherited the leadership after Carlo Gambino died in 1976. Castellano was a different kind of mob boss, a businessman more than a gangster, who ran the family from a mansion on Todd Hill in Staten Island, who favored construction contracts and meat distribution over the messy street rackets, and who held himself deliberately apart from the men who did the dangerous work below him. And Castellano had laid down one absolute, unbreakable rule. There would be no dealing in narcotics by anyone in the family. The penalty for violating it was death, plainly stated and widely understood. Castellano grasped, more clearly than the hungry men beneath him, that narcotics charges carried crushing federal sentences and drew the full machinery of federal law enforcement down on everyone within reach, and he wanted no part of that exposure. On the tapes, Ruggiero sneered at him for all of it. He called Castellano a milk drinker. He complained bitterly about the boss's distance from the street and his high-handed manner, and he did all of it on the same recordings, where he and Gene Gotti discussed the precise heroin business that Castellano had forbidden on pain of death. Then, on August 8th, 1983, the Gambino squad finally made its move. Agents arrested Angelo Ruggiero, Gene Gotti, John Carneglia, Mark Ryder, and Michael Coiro, and the government rolled out an indictment built on the mountain of tape it had patiently gathered. Gene Gotti was now a defendant in a major federal heroin case, charged on the strength of his own recorded voice describing his own crimes. The case would prove so slow to resolve, so repeatedly delayed and tangled, that it would eventually earn the distinction of being the oldest pending criminal indictment anywhere in the entire federal system. The tapes were now evidence in two very different courts. There was the public court, the federal one, where the government would labor for years to convict Gene Gotti of trafficking heroin. And there was the secret court, the one Paul Castellano was holding inside his own head, where those same recordings proved beyond argument that the Gotti crew had broken his single inviolable rule. For a while, one man stood between the Gotti crew and a death sentence handed down by their own boss. That man was Agnello Della Croce, the family's underboss, John Gotti's mentor, and, by blood, Angelo Ruggiero's uncle. Della Croce ran the traditional street wing of the family from the Ravenite Social Club in Little Italy, and he was the buffer that kept an uneasy peace between the cautious businessman on Staten Island and the aggressive crew out in Queens. As long as Della Croce lived and held his position, he could shield Ruggiero and the Gottis from the worst of Castellano's anger, could argue on their behalf, could stall, could keep the boss from acting on what everyone now knew the tapes contained. He was old and he was sick, but while he stood, the crew was protected. The pressure built slowly and then all at once. Castellano was himself indicted on racketeering charges in 1985, and he posted a bail bond of $2 million, and in the course of preparing his own defense, he made a discovery that enraged him beyond reason. He learned that his own home on Staten Island had been bugged by the FBI, and that the legal justification the government had used to plant a microphone inside the boss's house was the Ruggiero tapes. His own men had effectively handed the federal government the key to his front door. Castellano demanded the tapes for himself. He wanted to know exactly what was on them, wanted to hear his crew's recorded words with his own ears. Ruggiero refused to turn them over. He could not turn them over because the recordings proved that he and Gene Gotti and the others had been dealing heroin in direct defiance of the boss's law, and to place that proof in Castellano's hands was to hand him the justification to kill all of them. Della Croce tried to manage the standoff, tried to soothe the boss, but the situation was tightening steadily towards something that could no longer be talked away. And then the buffer collapsed. On December 2nd, 1985, Agnello Della Croce died of cancer, and the one man who could hold Castellano back was suddenly gone. The death removed the protection that had kept the Gotti crew alive, and then it did something worse. Castellano did not attend Della Croce's wake. To the men of the street wing, and to John Gotti above all, who had loved Della Croce as a second father, the boss's absence from the wake of the family's own underboss was an unforgivable insult, a public statement of contempt for the men who had served the family in the streets. Castellano compounded the injury by moving quickly to consolidate his power, naming a loyal and physically imposing soldier named Thomas Bellotti as his new underboss, a clear signal that the old guard was being shoved aside. Word moved fast through the family that Castellano was preparing to break up the Bergen crew, the Gotti faction, and that the drug tapes might yet cost the men recorded on them their lives. Gotti, with his ally Sammy Gravano and a captain named Frank De Chico, came to a shared conclusion that several factions of the family reached at once, that Castellano had to be removed before he removed them. When Agnello Della Croce died on December 2nd, 1985, that protection died with him, and John Gotti understood he had only one move left to make. At about 5:30 on the evening of December 16th, 1985, on a midtown sidewalk crowded with Christmas shoppers, the old order of the Gambino family ended in a burst of gunfire. Paul Castellano had arranged to have dinner at Sparks Steakhouse on East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue. As his car pulled up to the curb and he and Thomas Bellotti stepped out into the early winter dark, a team of gunmen dressed alike in trench coats and Russian fur hats closed in around them and opened fire at close range. Castellano was shot roughly 6 times. Bellotti was shot roughly 4 times. Both men died there on the pavement in the heart of the holiday shopping season, in one of the most brazen public assassinations in the history of American organized crime, executed in plain view of tourists and commuters. A block away, watching through the tinted windows of a car to confirm that the work had been done, sat John Gotti and Sammy Gravano. The killing had not been sanctioned by the Mafia's ruling commission, which was the gravest possible violation of the code, the murder of a sitting boss carried out without the permission of the other families. It was a coup, executed with stunning nerve and stunning recklessness, and against every expectation it worked. Within 2 weeks, John Gotti stood at the head of the Gambino crime family. The men of the organization began to display their fealty in the old ways, holding umbrellas over his head, leaning in to kiss him in the gesture of respect reserved for the boss of bosses, and federal agents watching from across the street recorded all of it, noting the sudden shift in how the man from Ozone Park was treated. He had murdered his way to the top of the most powerful criminal organization in the country, and for a moment it seemed he had gotten away clean with that too. There is an irony at the center of that moment so sharp that it organizes the entire rest of the story. The thing that drove John Gotti to murder his boss and seize the family was fear of the drug tapes, the recordings that proved his brother and his closest friends had broken Castellano's one absolute law. Those same recordings were, at that very moment, the foundation of the federal heroin case that would eventually send Gene Gotti to prison for 50 years. The reels of magnetic tape, pulled from a house in Queens, which were about to cost his brother nearly the whole remainder of his life, had just handed John Gotti the most powerful criminal organization in America. One set of recordings, two brothers, two opposite destinies set in motion by the identical source, branching apart at the exact same moment. While the heroin case ground on in the background, year after year, John Gotti set about becoming something no American mobster had ever quite been before, a celebrity who could not be convicted. He had a gift for the courtroom that looked from the outside like true invulnerability, and he displayed it 3 separate times in the years right around his rise to power. The first display came in a small and almost trivial case that produced an enormous public embarrassment for the government. A refrigerator repairman named Romual Piecyk had gotten into a dispute over a parking space in Queens in September of 1984, a confrontation that ended with Piecyk beaten and robbed of $325. Piecyk had complained to the police, had led them to a nearby restaurant, had pointed out John Gotti as one of his attackers, and had then repeated the identification before a grand jury, which indicted Gotti on assault and robbery charges that carried the possibility of 15 years in prison. Then Romual Piecyk learned exactly who John Gotti was. He began receiving threatening telephone calls in the middle of the night. The brakes on his work van were tampered with. He grew so frightened for himself and his pregnant wife that he bought a gun, moved out of his known address, and changed his contact information so that even the prosecutors had trouble reaching him. He wrote to the district attorney explaining that once he understood Gotti was not merely one of the punks in the mob, but a man in line to become a godfather, his interest in pursuing the matter had simply collapsed, because he could not and would not live the rest of his life in fear. When the case finally came to trial in the spring of 1986, Piecyk took the witness stand wearing dark glasses, pointedly refusing to look at the defendant, and announced that he could no longer recall who had attacked him. Asked directly whether he could identify anyone in the courtroom involved in the parking dispute, he kept his eyes away from Gotti and said that he could not. The charges were dismissed. Gotti walked out of the courthouse joking and laughing, and the New York Daily News printed across his front page a headline that would become legendary in the city, 3 syllables jammed together into a single word: I forgotti. The second and most consequential display came in a federal courtroom. A prosecutor named Diane Giacalone had assembled a sweeping racketeering case against Gotti and several co-defendants, charging the crew with running a criminal enterprise that spanned roughly 18 years and included murder, truck hijacking, gambling, and loan sharking. It was a serious and well-built case, the kind that should have ended in a long prison sentence, Instead, it ended in the spring of 1987 in acquittal on every count. Years later, the reason behind it became clear. The jury foreman, a man named George Pipe, had sold his vote before the trial even began. Through a connection to a leader of a Manhattan Irish gang, Pipe had lied his way onto the jury, and Gotti's people had paid him $60,000 to deliver an acquittal, no matter what the evidence showed. When deliberations began, most of the jurors favored conviction, but the planted foreman held out stubbornly and worked on the others, and the rest of the panel grew so frightened for their own safety that they finally voted to acquit across the board. Papa's betrayal of his oath would catch up with him in time, and he would later be convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to 3 years, but that reckoning came much later. In the moment, all the watching public saw was John Gotti beating the full weight of the federal government and strolling out free once again. The third display followed in 1990, when Gotti was tried in connection with the shooting of a carpenters union official and was acquitted yet again. 3 times the law reached out for John Gotti, and 3 times it closed its hand on nothing at all. The family tried to do for Gene exactly what it had done for John. The same playbook that had bought the foreman and frightened the panel in John's racketeering trial was deployed on Gene's behalf in the heroin case, and at first it appeared to work just as well. Gene Gotti remained free on his bond of $1 million for more than 4 years, while the case refused stubbornly to resolve. The first trial began in June of 1987 and ran for many months before it came apart entirely. On January 22, 1988, the judge presiding over it, Mark Costantino, declared a mistrial after finding a high likelihood that Gene Gotti had made deliberate efforts to tamper with the jury. A juror had testified at a special hearing that he was approached by a man who offered him a brand new BMW automobile in exchange for information about what the jurors were thinking, a man claiming to be acting on Gotti's behalf, and it emerged in the proceedings that the defendants had somehow learned the identities of at least 5 of the jurors hearing their case. The whole trial had to be thrown out and started over from the beginning. The second trial was a pared-down version with fewer defendants, and it ended in the same way the first had, with the machinery of the case breaking down before any verdict could be reached. The presiding judge this time, Joseph McLaughlin, was forced to dismiss a juror after cocaine was delivered to the man during deliberations, an extraordinary corruption of the process, even by the standards of these trials, and on July 27, 1988, with the remaining jurors reporting themselves hopelessly deadlocked, he declared another mistrial. 2 full trials, 2 complete collapses, and Gene Gotti was still a free man walking out of the courthouse. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked as though the Teflon that protected John had been painted over his brother too, as though the family's strange courtroom magic would simply grind the government down until it gave up and went home. But the magic was not really magic, and it could not be sustained forever against a government that flatly refused to quit. The third trial proceeded before Judge John Bartels, and this time the pieces fell differently. Angelo Ruggiero, the man whose endless talking on a tapped phone had created the entire case in the first place, was severed from the trial in the middle of April 1989 because he was dying of lung cancer and was too ill to endure the proceedings. The single most serious charge, the count alleging a continuing criminal enterprise, was dismissed by the judge during the trial and, once dropped, could never be brought against the defendants again. But the heart of the case, the heroin conspiracy and the racketeering and the possession charges, all of it grounded in the recordings, pulled from Angelo Ruggiero's house, went to the jury. And on May 23, 1989, after a trial lasting about 6 weeks, the jury convicted Gene Gotti and John Coneglia of running a heroin distribution ring. The trick had finally failed, completely and irreversibly. On July 7, 1989, Gene Gotti was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison and fined $75,000. John Coneglia, his partner in the trade, received the identical sentence down to the dollar. There was no appeal that could undo it, no witness left who could conveniently lose his memory, no juror who could be reached with money or a threat. The man whose recorded voice had insisted that nobody was to know but us was now going to prison until he was an old man and very possibly for the rest of his natural life. Angelo Ruggiero, whose mouth had built the case from the ground up, did not live to watch most of it play out. He died of his cancer that same year, and John Gotti, who blamed him bitterly for the catastrophe the tapes had become, refused to visit him on his deathbed, and, by his underboss's account, had to be dragged to the funeral. After the conviction, the family handled Gene the way large organizations handle assets that can no longer produce. Because he was now locked away in prison, they quietly demoted him from captain back down to soldier, and his older brother Peter took over the crew he had run. On July 7th, 1989, Gene Gotti was sentenced to 50 years, and the brother who had beaten everything was now the boss of a family that had just permanently lost him. The thing that finally beat John Gotti was the same thing that had doomed his brother: his own voice on a recording. Having watched the heroin tapes destroy Gene, having understood better than any man alive what recorded conversation could do to a person, John Gotti proceeded to make the very same mistake on a far grander scale. As boss, and against the explicit and repeated advice of Sammy Gravano, he insisted on holding regular meetings with his captains at the Ravenite Social Club on Mulberry Street, gathering the leadership of the entire family together in one fixed and predictable place, week after week, on a schedule the FBI could practically set its watch by. The Gambino squad did to him precisely what it had done to Ruggiero years before. Agents managed to get a listening device into an apartment directly above the Ravenite, an apartment where Gotti retreated to speak about sensitive matters, believing himself secure, and there they recorded the boss talking in detail about the business of the family and the men in it. The prosecutor building the new case, John Gleason, now had the boss of the Gambino family convicting himself in his own words. The recordings did more than supply evidence for the indictment. They supplied a defection that would break the family open. On the Ravenite tapes, Gotti could be heard speaking dismissively and dangerously about Sammy Gravano, his own underboss, in conversations that also tied both men to a string of murders. When Gravano learned what his boss had said about him behind his back, and understood that Gotti was quietly positioning him to absorb the blame for crimes they had committed together, he made the decision that would shatter the Gambino family for good. In late 1991, Sammy the Bull Gravano agreed to cooperate with the government and to testify against John Gotti, a violation of the Mafia's most sacred law, the code of silence that the entire organization rested upon. He would eventually confess on the witness stand to involvement in 19 murders and tie his boss directly to several of them, including the killing of Paul Castellano. The man who had sat beside Gotti in the car during the assassination at Sparks Steakhouse would now describe that entire night to a jury from the inside. The arrest itself had already come on December 11th, 1990, when agents walked into the Ravenite and took Gotti along with several others, charging him with racketeering, with 5 murders, including the killing of Castellano, and with extortion, obstruction of justice, gambling, loan sharking, and tax evasion. This time there would be no vanishing witness and no friendly foreman. This time the government built a courtroom that John Gotti could not reach into. The case came before Judge the Furs Leo Glasser in federal court in Brooklyn, and the judge took the single precaution that had been missing every previous time the man had been tried. Because of Gotti's well-documented history of tampering with juries and intimidating witnesses, a history written plainly into the records of his earlier acquittals and his brother's mistrials, the trial was conducted with an anonymous jury that was kept fully sequestered for its entire duration, the first New York trial run in that manner. No juror could be identified, approached, bribed, or frightened, because no one on the outside knew who they were. The tactics that had freed John Gotti 3 times and stalled his brother's case twice were rendered completely useless by the simple fact that there was no longer anyone to reach. The prosecution laid out the Ravenite recordings, in which the boss had convicted himself sentence by sentence, and then it put Sammy Gravano on the stand to describe the inner workings of the organization and the murders Gotti had personally ordered. The defense had nothing that could overcome a boss, caught at length on tape and then betrayed by his own underboss. On April 2nd, 1992, after deliberating only about 13 hours, the anonymous jury convicted John Gotti on 13 counts, including the murder of Paul Castellano, racketeering, and obstruction of justice. An FBI official named James Fox captured the reversal of fortune with a single sentence that turned the man's famous nickname inside out. He said that the Don was now covered in Velcro and that every charge had stuck. On June 23, 1992, Judge Glasser sentenced John Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole and fined him $250,000. The man was sent to the federal penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, one of the most restrictive prisons in the country, where he was held for something close to 23 hours of every single day inside a small cell. The Teflon was finally gone, and so was the man himself, sealed into a concrete cell in southern Illinois for whatever remained of his life. John Gotti, the brother who beat everything, died first. In 1998, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, and as the disease advanced, he was transferred from Marion to the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, the kind of federal hospital where the most powerful and most broken men of the American underworld go to end their stories. He died there on June 10, 2002, at the age of 61, 10 years into a sentence that was always going to hold him until death. He was buried in Queens, in the borough where he had built his crew. The family he had led, weakened by his conviction, gutted by Gravano's defection, and worn down by the relentless federal pressure of the era, never came close to recovering the power it had held at his height. His brother Peter took over as boss and was himself convicted twice in the years that followed and died in federal custody in 2021. His son, known to the public as Junior, drifted through a series of his own trials, several of which ended in deadlocked juries. The organization that John Gotti had murdered his way to the top of had already begun, by the time of his death, its long and irreversible decline. And then there was Gene, the brother who took 50 years, the quiet one who had held the umbrella, the man convicted on the strength of the very recordings that had launched his brother to the top of the family, simply endured. He was sent to the Federal Correctional Institution at Pollock in Louisiana in 1989, and there he stayed, year after year after year, while his brother became a national legend and then a corpse, while the family rose and crested and fell, while the entire world he had once known disappeared around him. He served nearly 29 years of his 50-year sentence, and on September 14th, 2018, an old man of 71, his dark hair long since gone snow white, Gene Gotti walked out of that Louisiana prison and into the free air. The brother the law could never quite catch had been dead for 16 years by then. The brother it caught and buried inside a 50-year sentence had outlasted him, had outlasted the legend entirely, and had lived to see the other side of the wall. What remains, when the noise and the legend are stripped away, is a story about a trick that was never magic. For most of a decade, the Gotti family appeared to have discovered a way to make criminal charges simply fail to stick, and the press built an enormous mythology around John Gotti as a man who had somehow risen above the law itself, untouchable and untouchably famous. But there was never any magic in it, not once. There was a juror paid $60,000 to hold out and frighten the rest of the panel into silence. There was a witness whose van brakes were cut and whose nights filled with threatening calls until his memory grew conveniently dim. There was the steady, patient, ugly labor of intimidation and bribery, the quiet conversion of fear and money into acquittals, repeated often enough that it began to look from the outside like invincibility. The trick worked because the people it depended on, the jurors and the witnesses, could be reached and bent, and it failed. Every single time it failed, for one reason, because the government eventually learned to build a case the family could not reach into, whether that meant a courtroom filled with recordings of a man convicting himself or a sequestered jury that no amount of money could find. The deepest irony in the story belongs to the man John Gotti killed. Paul Castellano had banned narcotics on penalty of death precisely because he understood that drug cases carried sentences capable of swallowing a man whole, and that they brought the full force of the federal government down on everyone standing nearby. He was right about all of it. Gene Gotti's 50 years were the living proof of exactly what Castellano had feared, the demonstration in flesh and time of why the boss had drawn his one absolute line and meant it. And John Gotti murdered Castellano in part to escape the judgment that those very drug tapes threatened to bring down on his crew, only to be destroyed in the end by the same kind of instrument, his own recorded voice, that had destroyed his brother. The tapes from the house in Queens never chose between the two brothers. They took them both. They simply took them in different years, through different courts, on different schedules, one crowned and then buried, the other buried alive for nearly 3 decades, and then, against every expectation, released into old age. Two brothers, raised in the same poverty, loyal to the same organization, defended by the same lawyers, and shielded by the same campaign of fear. One chose the spotlight, and the $1,000 suits, and the cameras, and for a few years he seemed entirely untouchable, and his name became famous in every corner of the country. The other stood quietly in his brother's shadow, held the umbrella in the rain, and went away for 50 years. And in the final accounting, it was the quiet one, the one the law actually caught, who outlasted all of them, who walked free into old age long after the legend had died alone in a prison hospital bed. The trick had never been magic. It had been fear and money and other men's silence, and all three of those things, in the end, ran out.